I know we've got a couple more questions that we need to go to, but Don, I did just want to ask you, how much of the expression of depression in the teenage years is a harbinger of trouble in later life? Because that's certainly what parents would fear.
Yeah, and I think it's a fear worthy of taking note of. I think that you know, the evidence would tell us that one of the best predictors of depression further in the lifespan is depression early on. So this is one of the reasons, and the very good reasons, why we should never ignore depression in adolescence. We should never wipe it off as just something that will happen, something that they get over. These kids are hurting, and we've got to do something about that. Otherwise, almost inevitably, they're going to respond to every other life crisis into the future with depression or something like it.
Question up here?
Yeah, my question links into that, and I was wondering whether we are insulating our youths too much and not exposing them to some real stressful situations in life. Instead, they're exposed to things on TV or on the internet, etc. So whether they're sort of extracted from the reality of things.
And I guess this goes back to that sense that people used to be children and then they were adults and they were expected to take on the responsibilities and problems of the real world. Some thoughts from the panel. Stephanie, you've talked to a lot of teenagers recently.
I have, yes. It's a good question. I'm not really sure whether I have an answer. I think that no matter what age group you look at, there's always pressures unique to that generation, and I think there are lots of pressures that are facing our teenagers today that perhaps, you know, people in previous generations haven't had to face. I guess off the top of my head, I think about things like cyberbullying and how that's just sort of totally taken over. So now that even when teenagers leave school for the day, they still have to face peer pressure and other sorts of bullying outside of school.
Jessica, that suggestion that perhaps we do coddle people perhaps a little bit too much, that their life takes place in another realm than the real world that adults have to cope in.
I guess I would say that online experiences and things like that, they're real experiences as well. And so they can, you know, have positive or negative impacts on your emotions. I mean, where you are physically doesn't necessarily correspond with how something affects you. And I guess also, as well as this increase in, you know, doing things online and the internet and movies and stuff, has also corresponded with an increase in the ease of transport and things like that. So although you can spend more time at home, you can also be out of the home much quicker than maybe in the past as well. So.
We've got a number of other questions, but just while we're on this, some teenagers, of course, will have much bigger issues in their lives. And someone reminded me just the other day about young carers, for example. Children who are coping with ill or disabled parents or family members, as well as school and all the kinds of normal teenage challenges. And obviously that's an enormous demand on someone who's perhaps 14, 15, 16. So there are kids, we should acknowledge, that are coping with really big things going on in their lives. Charlie, have you met people or encountered people that are facing those kinds of challenges?
Yeah, definitely. I went to a primary school which also had disabled children at it, and they were under a hell of a lot of pressure. You know, they had the full responsibility of, well, not full responsibility, but a lot of responsibility for looking after these kids during the day. And yeah, I think we do need to remember that, definitely. Yeah.
Not every teenager lives in a gilded castle, Antoinette, with full Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Question up here.
Thank you. It seems to me you set up a fairly stark contrast between this need to tolerate a normal range of moodiness and an importance in not ignoring it when a child shows signs of depression. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about how important it is to step in if you see a child slipping into what you think may be depression, and what the risks are if you risk undermining that child's sense of responsibility and maturity and undermining that child's sense of ability to cope with things. Should we take over for them, or do we need to let them mature, and how long should we wait and try to figure it out?
Don, I'll pass that one to you.
It's the fine balance that clinicians tread day in, day out. You know, at what point do we intervene? At what point do we have people use their own resources? Because ultimately they've got to learn to use their own resources. But being a reasonably cautious clinician, particularly where depression is concerned, my view is that you intervene sooner rather than later. And if you're a parent, then you start to talk to your adolescent. You don't let them sit alone in their room night after night after night with their ears jammed up with an iPod or sitting at the computer having no interaction at all. You try and engage them because it may not be, but it may be the beginning signs of them going into a depressive phase. And I think the sooner you start to engage them and bring them back into dialogue, bring them back into some level of reality, the better.
Of course, you risk then irritating them tremendously if they are just feeling a bit moody.
Can I also just add a little bit to what Don was saying as well, is that I think it's more helpful to think of the relationship with all family members, but between parents and their teenagers as an ongoing process, and you shouldn't be waiting for a sign to do something, that the relationship should be being moulded and fostered all along the way. And so that by maintaining as best and connected a relationship as you can, then subtle changes can come to your attention earlier. And there's also, it's a very good resource for them in terms of stopping further slip. So I wouldn't be waiting for a sign to start doing something, keeping that thing going and getting to know your teenager and know what's different about them. And if you're in doubt, you don't have to annoy them so much as you can ring up and access professional services and seek some assistance and ask friends and kind of seek further information. So there can be a whole range of support mechanisms that don't necessarily mean, I think you have depression, you're coming to see a psychologist. I think that's, there's a whole lot of previous signs that we can be working with.
Jessica, you've got a comment?
Yeah, some of our research has found that, it's often a difference in perspective of the parent versus the adolescent. And the parents feel like their adolescent is not going to them or not opening up or that there's trouble communicating, but the adolescents will still tell us that when something really big happens, it's their mum or their dad that they'll go to, that they know kind of when they're thinking big picture that they are the people who will be there for them no matter what.
That is an incredibly comforting thing to say. I really do feel like I am Tony Jones now because we've got our first Twitter question from the Twitterator. I'm fairly sure that's an invented word.
We've got a question from user Antoinette 01. It's quite a technical question. What is the difference between the identity versus id confusion crisis that Erikson proposed in 1969 and teenagers today? I'm assuming what they're trying to say was, how did we understand teenagers in 1969 versus how do we understand them now?
Okay, who wants to tackle that one? Look, familiar as I am with Erikson's oeuvre, I'm going to pass that on to the panel. Who'd like to take that on? Larry?
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of difference, but no, I'm not quite sure how I would answer that, and I don't know,
Jessica?
whether he would have a...
So Erikson was a developmental psychologist who posed all these life stages.
Of course he was.
And what he said was really important was that basically what happens is in each life stage there's a conflict that arises and you need to resolve that to move on adaptively. So what he spoke about with adolescence was identity versus identity confusion, and that's really about the ability to develop a sense of self, of who you are, and have that congruent with your values, your behaviour, how you think and how you act, to have a whole kind of self. And what that moves into next is then intimacy versus industry, and that's talking about that conflict that you can get between developing your relationships and developing your career and school and education and those kind of things, and they're the big conflicts that you get in adolescence.